Hello and welcome back to another episode of Critical Reactions with your host Bryan. We are going to be doing an album review today, which is where we check out an entire album track by track, exploring each track in isolation, what it's doing in a vacuum, and its place in a larger work. Today we're going to be looking at the 2018 album from the band Nacht und Gnosis. I'm not going to attempt to pronounce the title of this album, but you can check it out in the title of this video, right? It's a pretty lengthy title though. Most of these song titles are also lengthy and not in English, German, I believe. A couple of notes here. There's only 6 tracks at 7 minutes each, and then we have a final outro track at just 2.5 minutes. Being that it's such a short album at like 45 minutes and it's a short track list, I don't think this video is going to be very long. Also, it's going to be a bit on the shorter side because as far as I can tell, there are no published lyrics anywhere. I checked Sonic Hits, I checked Genius, I did general web search, I checked Dark Lyrics, and Metal Archives, which, despite this being a black metal album, Metal Archives does not deem it metal enough to be present on their site. And that's usually a really good place to go for finding more obscure bands' lyrics. I don't know where Metal Archive gets their lyrics, but they tend to have things that most other sites don't. But yeah, it's not metal enough for them, so they don't have a page for them. So there'll be no lyrical discussion on this album at all. We're probably looking at something around the 2.5 hour mark then, is what I'm going to assume. With all that said, we're 2 minutes into this intro. Let's just dive in and see what's going on with our opening track. Interesting way to start this. Still trying to come around to this. I know we're like 2 minutes in. Still not entirely sure what to think. think it's an interesting execution. I don't think there's anything going on here that's weird as far as what's being combined. It really is just how they're combining all of these ideas. It feels so strange. Huh. So I had mentioned earlier that this is a black metal album. At least that's how it's classified on Rate Your Music. It's black metal, comma, atmospheric black metal, if I remember correctly. I think it's a good place to come at it from. I'm glad this was just described to me as such, so that I put my mindset, hey, we're gonna be listening to black metal today. It's gonna be a bit of a rough time. I mean, yeah, y'all know my relationship with black metal. So I'm coming at it a little bit low. I've set the bar pretty low as far as my enjoyment of this, what I'm expecting, the type of things I'm going to be listening for. And then I get given this, which I'll admit I'm still a bit iffy on. I think as a first track, it's kind of bounced off of me. I'm a little intrigued by it. I'm glad that we get to check out another track. I don't know if I'm glad that we get to check out 6 other tracks, but I'm intrigued. This song didn't quite do it for me, but I think they have an interesting idea here, and I might find something I quite enjoy in this album eventually. And starting from low expectations and being intrigued by it, I think is a lot better than starting with high expectations and being disappointed. There's also a blackened element to it as well. The production is blackened. The vocal style is a bit of that blackened shriek harsh. Um, we even have guitar tones and drumming sounds, the production on the drums themselves, that I think lend themselves well towards third wave black metal. But compositionally, this isn't. We never quite hit the blast beats, the 16th note bass kicks, the 16th note picking on the guitars. It never quite reaches that overwhelming wall of sound. This reminds me more of post black metal and even a little bit of some of the more experimental second wave black metal that we've listened to that focuses more on one of the key elements of black metal, and that's atmosphere. The atmosphere here is the goal. It's achieved through a couple of different ways. One is, of course, the harmony, the chord progression. There's definitely some eeriness to it, some darkness to it, particularly during the metalier bits, the guitar and drum and harsh vocal sections. But it's also supported in the more electronic sections, which are sparsely performed. There's not usually a lot of things going on. Primarily focuses on chords and ornamental ideas and occasionally some spoken word. But they are very pensive moments. The song is not too interested in moving forward. It is interested primarily in what is this section? What does it feel like? Let's explore that. There's rarely any movement, direction, momentum in these sections. They are in stark opposition to the metalier sections that we have, which, while still not, again, utilizing 16th notes and having that ridiculous momentum and drive, still have forward momentum to them that isn't really presented in the more atmospheric electronic sections. And that's where I sort of meant earlier that I don't think the two ideas here are in opposition. They're both aiming for atmosphere, but they do it in two different ways, and the transitions between the two styles is not well done. I think the harsh transition works well in sparsity, in rarity. I think about the 3-minute mark when we shifted from our intro into our extended electronic atmospheric section that took us pretty much through the rest of the track. I thought that was a fine, harsh transition, just moving from one idea to the next. But at the beginning, it felt like every 8 bars, we were just turning on the engine, turning off the engine, turning on the engine, turning off the engine. And so we'd have these driving metal sections, and then just out of nowhere, it's pensive, silence, isolating, and then back to the drive, and then back to the pensiveness. And it never really clicked for me. I'm not sure what they were attempting to achieve with that. I think a little bit more fluidity moving between the ideas would have worked well, and they could have used the harsh transition in the middle of the track as an indicator that we're doing something different now. We're not going to be moving back and forth. We're sticking with one sound for the remainder of the track. Um, it was an odd opening idea, I think, and it really did not grab me at all. I mean, y'all know my bias for fluidity and composition, and they started off the track with a lack of fluidity, a really strong rigidity in the structure of the song. I was really worried with how often they did it, that it would be the thing we have to listen to for the next 40 minutes. that would have been a bit grating for me. But I'm glad to see they did stick around with one idea for quite some time, and we got to further explore that one concept. It was a bit stagnant for me, but I'd rather take that stagnancy over a hyper rigid contrast. Um, yeah, yeah, I'll just leave it at that. Um, I am really curious though how they're going to balance out these two sides. I mentioned that they're both going for atmosphere, but they do it in slightly different ways. Production is really important on both of them, but as far as I'm concerned, aside from the fact that they both use chords to achieve the emotional resonance, the composition style of both is drastically different. The metal section is more driving. There are, at least in this section, eighth notes, constant eighth notes in the guitars and drums. The heavier vocal style, um, and just the bite of the electric guitar. They do utilize some ornamental ideas, particularly from a keyboard or a synthesizer in these sections as well. One thing that stands out to me is that really shrill sound. We kind of pierced in, opened the envelope so we got to hear more of it, and then narrowed it down until it was a very sharp ringing. Um, I mean, it was a cool modulation of this one sound. It was a bit too high pitched and too narrow. It felt piercing to me in a way that made me feel uncomfortable. Sonically, it's not that, it made me feel uncomfortable by listening to it, that it created feelings of anxiety or anything like that. It just wasn't a good sound for my ear. It sounded like a fire alarm. A US fire alarm. I assume different countries have different sounds for their alarms. Um, but if they do, this is very much the fire alarm I think of as a U.S. citizen, in schools and theaters, any public place, office buildings. They all have a very distinct type of alarm. And what made me think of that is that I realized, or was educated upon, I suppose, just a few years ago that police sirens are different in different regions and countries and stuff. And it was just something you never really think about. And so you go look it up and you use YouTube videos of like all these police sirens and like they're all different. It's kind of cool. So, just right now I'm thinking maybe fire alarms are different around the world too. But yeah, there's just this very shrill, piercing, high-pitched sound to what they were doing that reminded me of a fire alarm. And it didn't give me the anxiety of it. It's just a very high-pitched, piercing sound that I don't like nails on a chalkboard. But yeah, so a huge tangent there. Anyways, they do utilize the synthesizer or the keyboard to create sounds within the traditional metal aspect as well. And I thought that was a nice touch. Um, there were a few sections that utilized what I think was clean electric guitars as well, which felt kind of odd. You have the drive of the black metal-esque composition, but not done on these biting, gritty guitar tones. And it's usually paired with aggressive drumming and harsh vocals, and it was just an interesting combination of timbres. I think if the electric guitar, the clean electric, had been paired with a distorted electric, it would have been okay. But as it stands, it was just odd. And maybe it makes sense in some context. I mean, it feels odd to me because I've never heard anything like it, right? It's not that it's a bad decision. I just have no context for it. So maybe it becomes less odd over time. Maybe they'll continue to do it and it won't be as striking to me by the end of the album. But it was an interesting decision. You create this composition that's typically associated. And that's the thing, too. It's a typical association. It's not like these two things are intrinsically linked. It's just we typically put them together in a way. But there's this driving power, width, largeness to the composition. We normally pair it with a large sound. And it just kind of feels out of place here. I think if they had chosen to go more of the Baroque route that black metal tends to go in, and they had written Baroque music for clean electric guitar, I think that would have been fine because that's kind of just classical guitaring right there. You know, if you go to university for classical guitar, you're going to play a lot of that, usually on an acoustic, but still, the idea I think is still sound. But the fact that they went with more of the bluesy or tritone sounds of metal on this cleaner guitar sound instead of the Baroque ones, it's a sound I just got to get used to, I suppose. It's just like I said, I have no context for it. It sounds kind of strange. They're not utilizing tones and timbres that would most benefit what they're writing, right? And I think that's an interesting concept too. We don't think about too often in metal, but in classical music, in electronic music, anytime that you have a wide choice of instrumentation, it's important to consider what instruments are playing what. A good song might sound like garbage if the wrong instruments are playing the parts, and it's because, again, biases and cultural expectations of specific sounds. Nothing is intrinsically linked to anything, but we have over time associated sounds to specific emotions and vibes. But we expect certain instruments to do certain things in specific situations. We expect specific lines to be associated with specific instruments. Can you imagine taking a like fluttery 16th note run line, normally for the flutes, to have like a whimsical element to it and giving it to like a tuba? It just doesn't quite sound the same. It has a completely different tone to it, and I think most people would listen to that and say, it didn't quite work, even if they don't know why it doesn't work. And we do have biases for this stuff. And hearing this really massive sound attributed to this quieter instrument, especially when everything around it is aggressive and large too, it feels like an odd choice. It even in an subjective state could be described as a bad choice, the wrong choice. So I'm still kind of coming around to that. the, this whole section was supposed to be juxtaposing the atmospheric ideas. Um, so yeah, I don't think that the metal necessarily works with the electronic stuff because they just go for a different thing. The metal, as we just described, very large, very wide, very powerful, and it's sort of a wall of sound for its atmosphere. The electronic side is sparseness, it's minimalism, it's barely anything playing, barely anything moving, lots of suspended tones, really exploring the sound as a whole instead of smashing their way through it. I don't think that they are impossible to combine together. I just don't think that these two styles showcased here in this specific composition work too well to complement each other. It felt like two drastically different ideas moving back and forth between them. Channel surfing between two shows. When one show goes on commercial, you go to the other one. When that one hits commercial, you go back to the first one. And you're juggling these two ideas, and they don't have any reason to be read together. They're two completely different programs, but you're experiencing them in this piecemeal combination. And that's sort of what this felt like. I think both sections are done well on their own. I just don't see how they complement each other in any way. Aside from the fact they're both atmospheric focused, which is, yeah, if you're going to write something black metal adjacent, staying within an atmospheric focus is definitely going to be the way to go. It's the strength of black metal, and I think they did a fantastic job of saying, okay, let's start with atmosphere, let's end with atmosphere, let's find different ways to explore an atmosphere. And I appreciate the experimentation, and I hope it gets a bit more refined throughout this album. It just doesn't really pop off to me on this one track. Did you all see the volume meter over there? I was watching the volume for a majority of that track, primarily because they never hit peak. It's not even just a black metal thing either. Black metal certainly likes to sit at peak. For a lot of black metal tracks, if you watch the volume meter, it doesn't even bounce, it just like flats. It sits flat at the top. Black metal is just very much a wall of sound style of music, especially that third wave style that I find stereotypically covers the sound of the genre. This would occasionally hit the top, but a majority of the sounds were just shy of max volume. It was mostly accents, especially snare hits, some cymbal hits that would push us over the top and to hit max volume, but everything else was sort of 2 or 3 decibels underneath that. I find it really interesting to have that sort of dynamic range. I mean, it's not much, 2 to 3 decibels. Really, that's not a lot, but for black metal, it's multitudes. It is vast for a style of music that tends to sit at full volume consistently. To have any range between the majority of your sounds and max volume is massive. It is a huge decision to make. I don't know if this group went out and said, hey, we want to make black metal, but we have a synthesizer. Let's do electronica black metal, or if they just made music that they thought sounded good. But regardless, there seems to be a very purposeful decision here to not have the entire song sitting at full volume. And when we get into the more of the atmospheric stuff, it dips even below that. We were at 50% volume for about a minute there in the middle of the track, somewhere between minutes 3 and 5. It's really interesting to see that sort of volume control in a project like this. It doesn't really seem like one that I would expect to do that, but I'm really enjoying the nuance of that. I'm curious how they're going to expand upon that, if they're going to expand upon that. We may have seen their entire hand right here in the opening track, but I did think that was a nice touch. It allows the song to not feel overwhelming, and that little bit of headroom at the top allows a little bit of extra expression for the track in a way that most black metal bands don't have. Alright, I think it's going to wrap this one up. Let's push forward with one of 2 tracks I'll be able to pronounce today. This next one is called Apparitional Power of Darkness. Yeah, I guess let's just dive in. Like I said, there's no lyrics out there, so we're going to be skipping lyrical discussions. I guess let's just push forward. Sort of has an industrial sound to it. There is more of that traditional black metal sounds. A little bit of time discrepancies here. Either the drummer rushes for a second or the guitar drag every once in a while. Playing around with some interesting tonality in here as well. Interesting. I think it just said creation through destruction. Might be the first time I've picked up black metal lyrics. Yeah, once again we have a little bit of time desync. There's one of those shrill sounds from the synth. Interesting idea on the drums.
Пусть исполнится то, что задумал. Пусть и не поверит. И пусть посмеются над своими страстями.
Oh, I forgot about this too. I think the first one had the spoken word stuff.
Энергия, а лишь трение между душой и внешним миром. А главное, пусть поверят в себя.
It's like
беспомощными, как дети.
a natural
Потому
hum.
что слабость велика, а сила ничтожна. Когда человек родится, он слаб и гибок.
Once again, is this detuned instruments or microtonal? Kind of the same thing.
А когда оно сухо и жестко, оно умирает. Черствость и сила.
One just has a little bit more intention of tonality.
Гибкость и смелость выражают свежесть бытия. Поэтому что отвертело, то не победит.
I wonder if these sections would make more sense if I knew what was going on lyrically. That almost sounds like field recording.
Now is your father of me. Give your will to live. I am the wellspring which you flow. When I am gone, you will have never been. What you will be without me.
Yeah, so I think I've formed my thoughts a little bit more on the friction between these two styles. This song puts it front and center for me and clearly explains where I think the issue is with this project. Who's the audience? Now, before we get into this, let me state that I believe that all art should be done for the artist's purposes, for their passion, for their joys, what they want to see in the world, if they just need to get it out of them, if they just want to see what happens, the pure experimentation of art. I don't think that this shouldn't exist for what I'm about to talk about, but this is the perspective that I want to go into. Who's the audience on this, right? Are you making music for black metal fans? I think the first half of this track would satisfy them. It's driving, it's aggressive, it's wall of sound, it's massive. It's just metal, right? That's what black metal is. I think it's just very simple metal. It just speaks to that monkey brain part of humanity where it's just like big noises, lots of energy, lots of speed, sound good, right? And none of that applies to the end. I think the audience for the atmospheric final 3 minutes of the track is not the same audience for your 3 minutes aggressive opening. And while there probably is a Venn diagram that captures some people in the middle, I personally believe there's going to be a small crossover there because these two aspects aim for diametrically opposed ideas. One is just aggressive, massive, booming. The other one is introspective, calming, and exploratory. It's the difference between the person who, speed runs through a video game and the person who takes their time and explores every nook and cranny and wants to get to know the virtual world. Both styles of play are fine, but they're very different. And that's what's going on here. We are exploring atmosphere. The atmosphere is eerie, it is dense, it is heavy. That's true in both styles. But the way to get there is so different. I don't see too many people really enjoying both sides of this album. And again, having an audience isn't a requirement for uh, the justification of art's existence. I believe this album should exist. I think it's really interesting that it exists, and if nobody in the world loves it except for this band, that is perfectly fine. But I do think it's interesting to think about audience for this specific discussion because it's sort of what I ran into on this track. I'm not a big fan of the black metal, but it's fine. I've gotten to a point with black metal that we can coexist. I don't want to see them outside of work, but I will have nice conversations with them and about them while I'm on the job. That kind of vibe, right? Black metal and me, we're coworkers. We get along and get the job done. And I'm listening to the black metal. I'm like, okay, this is fine. We got things going on here. And then it just kind of stops and we get this long form ambient writing. And I have to completely reconfigure my approach to the music. I have to completely shift gears to not even just appreciate, but on the base level of understand what's even happening. It's just a completely opposite approach to exploring that atmosphere. And so, even from a listening perspective, as somebody who isn't a big fan of either one of these styles but is trying to understand it, I find a lot of difficulty switching between them. I don't see a lot of stuff going on between them that are shared. And, it makes me wonder how other people, even casually, how would you listen to this casually? When I listen to music casually, I'm usually in it for a specific mood. Maybe I want angsty and angry, and I'll put on some metal. Maybe I want to chill. I'll put on some pop or some jazz. Maybe I want something that makes me feel proper, and I'll put on some Baroque music. It's a specific mood in mind. Even if it's not a feeling like that, maybe I'm just in for something fun, and I'll listen to an album that goes through a lot of different genres. Um, I usually have an intention in mind, and I think that the connective tie here, being atmospherically driven, isn't quite strong enough to tie these together into something that would be cohesive, that somebody would want to seek out and enjoy this specific combination rather than an album that better focuses on one of the styles that they go for. And that's what makes it a bit awkward for me. With that said, I do think that they achieve both of these styles rather well. I don't think we talked about this last break, last analysis section, primarily because we didn't really get to hear either side really well. We got to hear the atmospheric side for a while, but I didn't think it was too well developed. Really going for that minimalistic sound, but I think that's how they do it. So now that I have some confirmation that that's their goal, I feel more equipped to talk about the execution of these ideas. The black metal section, we had more of a rocky thing going on in the first track where it was slower. We had metal tones for sure. I would still describe it as metal, but it wasn't the 16th note driving wall of sound thing that we saw in this track. Regardless, though, this is solid third wave black metal. 16th notes coming from everyone, dyads from our two guitars, shrieks coming from the vocals, and just constant attacks coming from our drums. Doing this for such a long time. 3.5 minutes, I think. 4 minutes, maybe, for this track. No breaks, no stops, constant drive, constant momentum. It's black metal. I'm not going to say that it's changing anything. It's not revolutionizing the sound. It's very iterative, but it does it well. I think some of their dyads are interesting. The harmonic chord progressions they move through are nice to listen to ish. The production's clear enough. I can hear everything. It isn't super fuzzy traditional mid-fi black metal. It's a bit more clearer than that. And so I got to hear some of the chord progressions going on here, but there really isn't much to speak of as melody over the chord progression, and that kind of leans into the atmospheric side. It is foundationally explicit, and then you have textures around that, the drums, the vocals. There isn't really a strong sense of melody there, and that's to help you focus on the atmosphere, the emotion, the way that it feels, more so than any one specific line. Um, There are some timing issues in here, it gives it a really human feel. I couldn't really tell if the drums were rushing or the guitars were dragging, but we saw that in a couple of places where they just weren't lining up properly all the time. For something as rigid as this, it really stands out. We've talked about this before, but I don't think I've ever brought it up, is that when you have something a bit more syncopated, um, and you're playing off of, every beat, basically, you can get away with a little bit more sloppiness because you're also syncopating and emphasizing off beats, intro to beats, like the 16th, the quarter of a beat you might be emphasizing. And so since you're not always emphasizing the beat itself, you don't have that metronome basically baked in, and you can get away with a little bit of fudging. But when it comes to black metal and the rigidity of it, it locks it in. It becomes mechanical, and anytime you veer even the slightest away from it, it's going to be felt massively. Some people like that. It gives it that human element, and I know we've talked about bands in the past, especially in the doom genre, but some in the black metal, people really like uh, the human side of that, and just the fact that it feels real, not mechanical, not like it was, tweaked and quantized in an audio workstation. It's subjective, everyone's gonna have their own taste to it. I prefer a bit more rigidity. A little bit of fluctuation is fine. This was too much for me. Humans are gonna make errors. I don't expect perfection, especially playing this. The sheer endurance of it is ridiculous, but I need a little bit more precision than what was put on display here, just personally. Um, but like I said, it's an aspect of black metal. It's not like they're doing it poorly. They're doing it their way, and it's a way that has shown up in black metal before. When we look at the ambient side, we have spoken word, we have eerie tones and textures, we have sometimes a moving melody line. Not really melody though, it's more melodic. It's like an outlining, like a walking bass line kind of thing, just not on a bass and about an octave or two higher than a bass would usually play it. Uh, it creates atmosphere well in a minimalistic sense. It feels sparse, it feels isolating, but it still has that eeriness. It still has a little bit of that weight, and there's a little bit of anxiety to it, a fear of not really knowing where you're at, like being lost in a forest at night. It it accomplishes it well. It's a bit too sparse for me, a bit too on the minimalistic side for my personal tastes, but I don't think that they're doing anything wrong here. Um, and there is a nice variety of sounds as well, since I think most of it is handled by a keyboard. They can, they have a wide palette they can choose from as far as what kind of sounds they want to do. And they do have the spoken word in there, which gives it a nice little bit of extra flair. We do hear the guitar sometimes in this, and I think there's field recording. I heard the dripping of water at the beginning of this. Could have just been, like a teardrop kind of sound though, too. Didn't have to be field recordings. But I also think I heard some sort of organic hum, like just the sound of things existing. If you ever go out, um, well, bringing up a forest, I'll do it again. Go out into the middle of a forest, in like getting close to nighttime. Don't go in the middle of the night. It can get kind of spooky, but yeah, just kind of hearing the natural hum of things. Maybe it's the running of water off in the distance, creating a white noise, or insects making whatever sounds they make, and it's never perfect silence, and that's kind of what this felt like at times. There was also a section, I think it was a compressed, muffled, distorted guitar sound, but it kind of sounded to my ears like somebody playing trumpet in a practice room. Practice rooms are pretty padded, very minimal sound comes out of them, and that's kind of what it sounded like to me. So I don't know what that really was, but that kind of gave me some field recording vibes there as well. I don't know, there's just a lot going on for being so minimal. It doesn't sound like there is a lot, but there's so many layers. And I think that creating that minimalism out of quite a few elements is a skill within itself. It also creates a section that feels emptier than it is. And that creates the isolation and adds impact to the atmosphere without it actually being an empty section, which could be boring to listen to. As I stated, both sides here are done very well. I don't see how they work together. And that's going to be my big hang up, I think, on this album. I really wish they would just come together. I do. Have the guitar line dwindle down into something else, bring in the atmospheric stuff, have the guitar play over it, bring in the spoken words, have the guitar line mold, do a baton pass to the synthesizer to take that melody, and then have the bass come in and play something underneath it. Bring in the harsh vocals during the atmospheric part. Uh, Bring percussion in. Both of our atmospheric sections have been percussion free. Just have a real light sound. Just closed hi-hat. with some interesting rhythmic ideas. Something to marry these two sides and tell me that they belong together and they aren't just two bands sharing a recording studio taking turns. Um, it's just, I think that's my big hang up. I don't like either of these sounds. They're not something I'm going to go explore on my own, but it is frustrating to listen to the two of them do their things entirely separately without any crossover. I think even the harmonic side is changed. There isn't even that chord progression I could say ties them together. It always feels like it's just a completely different track. And I think if they had gone, if we had been listening to 4 tracks so far, where we alternate between a metal track and an ambient track and a metal track and an ambient track, at least then I could separate the ideas out as isolated parts of a larger whole. But they're strung together into these singular experiences, and I just don't think they complement each other. With that said, let's push forward, see what's going on with track 3, and see if they change my mind at all. This is another way to do it too. Create the ambient isolation with the metal side. Just give me some crossover. That's all I'm asking for. I don't care how it's done. Oh yeah, yeah. Let's go. Really cool melody, overwhelming power of the distorted guitar, light percussion, keeping with the simpler, more minimalistic atmosphere. Really great percussion production on the percussion, pushing it out to the extent that it is, rather than trying to put it middle where the drum kit would be. And chimes, yes. Yeah. And so when we move to the truly minimal spoken word section, it feels like a natural direction for that last, for the track to go. And see, if we do decide to take this into the more traditional black metal sounds, we already have the sound of the guitars here to pull us into that and smoothly transition into 16th notes and blast beats anytime we want here. Interesting choice to digitize the vocals too. Even this section being a bit different feels connected to our previous because of the percussion, because of the harmonic similarities. A bit of a rougher transition, but I'll forgive it. Yeah, a nice gradual movement. Interesting rhythmic ideas. And see, this is a nice callback as well. We used the spring sound as a transition technique, and now it's part of the composition. I love it when bands listen to me. No, that makes me sound like a narcissist. My opinion isn't any more right or important or correct than anybody else's, of course, and never more important than the artist's. But I do think it's awesome that I just got done talking about how I wanted more cohesion between the two sides. I wanted them to be present together, and I wanted the transitions to be smoother between them, and that's exactly what we got here. I could listen to more of this. Again, it's not particularly what I would go out of my way for, but I didn't hate it, and that's a pretty big compliment for black metal. I haven't brought up the vocals yet. They're not my cup of tea. They really aren't. But they're doing interesting things with them aside from just the harshes. Something I completely forgot about was we had higher pitched cleans in track 2, which kind of had a feminine quality to them. When I was looking the band up, I don't think I saw that they had any female uh, musicians in them, but maybe I was wrong. But here we had the digitization of the vocals as well, which is an interesting choice to go. And they're trying things outside of the typical black metal shriek, and I'm appreciative of it. I see they only have 92 monthly listens on Spotify, which one, I think they're just really unknown. Definitely a more niche band, I think, but also it kind of leans into that area where I said I don't know what their audience is. I think for people who really enjoy this, that small subset of the ambient electronic and atmospheric black metal Venn diagram, that very small midpoint, this is going to be exactly what you want to listen to. But I think it's going to encompass such a niche community. 92 monthly listens sounds about right. Maybe we can bump that up though. Maybe one of you watching this is like, I really love this. I don't know what Bryan's on about. This is perfection. Now you have a new band to go listen to, bump those numbers up for them. Um, I have a question about monthly listeners. I was gonna ask how they calculate it. Like if I listen to all 7 of these tracks, so I bump the number up 7 times, but no. I'm one account, so I'll bump it up one because it's listeners. I've been reading it as monthly listens for like the past 2 years. uh, my reading comprehension, man. That's not even reading comprehension. That's pure reading skills. My mind gets too far ahead of my eyes and just injects things into it. You've probably heard that in my speech too, where I'll be ahead of where I'm talking and kind of jumble up words. But yeah, when I read too, I read like half of it and my mind fills in the blanks based on what it thinks. And there's sometimes it just screws me up entirely. And just like right now. Anyways, but yeah, this was just a joy. Everything felt cohesive. We had 7 minutes of one song. And it went through like 3 different styles here. It's not like it just stuck with one single idea and was boring for 7 minutes. The monotony of it. They went through different ideas. They built up layers. They explored several sounds. We did have more ambient sections. We had more metally sections. There was spoken word. There was the digitized cleans. We had we had a jaw harp in here. How cool is that? We had callback or foreshadowing, however you want to look at that. But I really think the jaw harp was used as a transition first. So I view that as a callback, bringing in something in a completely different context, more so than foreshadowing something where it would be its predominant usage later. Uh, we had minimal atmospheric sections with the guitar and percussion. It wasn't the drum kit, but we did have percussion in there. Hand drums, it sounded like wooden hand drums, a lot of finger technique to get lighter, higher pitched ideas rather than using the palm, which is a bit of a wider sound. Yeah, just everything I wanted. A nice, cohesive whole track where everything works well in telling a singular story, a singular vision, and done so in a way that encompasses both of the sides of their writing. This is what I've wanted from them. And I'm so glad it happened here. This is honestly probably going to be my favorite track on the album. I keep track of every album I listen to. I write down what my favorite song was from it. And I think this is going to be it. Track number 3, because I can't pronounce that. Track 3, Favorite. I'll update that later if I need to. There's another. My brain just skipped the date. It was already on later, and I just never even sent the signal to my mouth. I'll up that later. uh, but yeah, just everything I wanted. Here's something we haven't talked about. I've brought it up a couple of times. Intonation. It could be that they're using a non-12 tone tuning system. Another term for that, usually, we would call it microtonal. Microtonal can be beautifully evocative, or what it typically sounds like to my ears is balancing very precariously on something that is highly dissonant. It really depends on the composition, but more importantly, how your microtones are divvied out. There's a lot of different ways to do microtonal tunings, and they all have various levels of intonation quality, whether they're harmonic or dissonant, usually falling somewhere in the middle. And of course, a lot of that is contrasted against our default or biased intonation sounds, because even the 12-tone just intonation that most of the Western world uses isn't perfectly in tune either. Well, at least not on every interval, but we are used to hearing the inconsistencies, and that is our base level of proper interval distances. That's the same word, but whatever. So microtonality has two hills to climb up simultaneously. One, the intervals are different in ways that can be dissonant, and two, the intervals are different in ways that clash with our already imperfect but status quo sound of what we expect intervals to sound like. We're talking a lot about microtonality. I don't even know that they are using microtonality, at least not in the traditional sense of divvying up an octave into smaller chunks than the 12 that we typically use. It could also just be tuning, which, given the roughness in performance, the sloppiness of the playing we talked about last track, where the faster sections had a bit of felt like dragging from the guitarists. It could also be that the guitars just aren't perfectly tuned either. And so we end up with sections like in this track and the previous one where two guitars are playing and they are just creating levels of dissonance. The intervals between the two notes that they're playing just don't sound, I was going to say don't sound good. That's subjective, but they are dissonant. They are creating fluctuations in their sound waves as they overlap and clash. That dissonance could be palatable or even preferable to some people. I find it to be a negative. I think it does add to the atmosphere that creating from an artistic angle, it is probably the right choice, but from a musical angle, I really hate it. But given the allowed flexibility in their timing, it's possible also they have an allowed flexibility in their tuning. And that's where we get segments like that. It could also just be entirely uh, purposeful. When they get to that section, they just tweak their tuning knob a little bit, play the section, and pull it back in because they're not always out of tune. So there's always that aspect to figure as well. Um, yeah, I think it's going to cover it for it here. I mean, on the whole, at the end of the day, a lot of this is either minimal or iterative black metal. And so there's not really a lot to talk about outside of the atmosphere, which, if they changed emotions, I think I'd have something to talk about from track to track, but is consistently just eerie, a little moody and dreary, really going for that, yeah, for lack of a better phrase, that evil black metal sound. I do like the application of the moodiness in the electronic sections, the more industrial moments. I feel like it has a little bit less of just uh, an evil sound to it, and they kind of go for something a little more nuanced, usually accomplishing some sort of level of tension with isolation, and that is already introducing levels beyond what the black metal typically does, but they're still primarily working within this bounds. And it creates not a lot of room for discussion about the varying emotional atmospheres here because they're all the same. And so I do kind of worried. I do kind of worry now that we're halfway through the album. What more do I have to talk about? I've kind of hit all the main topics, and these three songs, aside from the extra level of cohesion here, have all sought out and executed on pretty much the same vision. It reminds me a bit of the Cryptopsy album that we listened to, where they played death metal, I think was the genre for that one. And they didn't really change up much from song to song, and eventually just reached a point where I was like, yep, that's another death metal track. Let's move on. Very different from like Will Wood that we checked out in the normal album from a while ago, and even Unexpect that we did last week, where they had a lot of variety in their sound, what they were going for compositionally, even if they didn't have a lot of variety in their instrumentation. So I suppose with that said, let's push forward and go into the fourth track. Ooh!
Den här vägen, mina damer och herrar, följ vägvisaren. Om ni skulle vilja komma någonstans när ni går här, då är det inte er den här skivan vänder sig till. Men om ni tillhör de nyfikna barn som alltid vill veta vad det eller det betyder, då är det er jag talar till.
Here we go again with a little bit of that tonality and dissonance. Is that a timpani? I think this is the only time I'm going to say this for this album, but I really wish they had a larger sound sphere here. Everything's just a bit too muddied, and some extra clarity would have went a long way, despite them going for this wall of sound. I think it even would have been better. More wallier of soundier. kind of feel like this sits as an interlude. Technically, we are at the beginning of the back half of this. We had 3 7-minute tracks to begin with. We have 2 7-minute tracks ahead of us, and then this 4-minute interlude and the 3-minute outro. Altogether, it's 42 minutes, give or take. Actually, that's what it is. 43, 46, which is very closely divisible. 6 groupings of 7. So yeah, we had our 3 groupings of 7 to begin with, and now we have our back 3 groupings of 7. It's just divided up into 4 tracks. Yeah, we are right in the middle. This is a perfect time for an interlude, something completely different, and they do that. I'm torn on it. I like the concept of the interlude. I like the idea of breaking up the experience of the album. We have had a lot of just heavy. Well, it doesn't really break it up, does it? I was going to say we've had 3 tracks of heavy atmosphere. It's nice to get away from that, but this was more heavy atmosphere. And so I don't. We do have a timbre difference. That's nice. We bring in strings, timpani, expanded percussion. I enjoy all of this. I thought it was really nice to change things up that way. We also have a new vocalist present. The idea, though, does, I think, drag on a little bit without any lead melody or something to take the focus. It is all foundational and ornamental. There's very little in here that is designed to be in the spotlight, and thus it just sort of is for quite some time. There's a nice movement through it all, the way that it layers, delayers, transitions to new ideas, and then revisits older ideas in a new light. The evolution of the track works very well. I also like the way that the metal band, the guitars and drums and bass, how they fit into this metallic side. The atmospheric side. Even a little bit, we could call it the orchestral side. We do have an expanded percussion utilizing instruments we would typically see in a symphony, and we have brass. Granted, we're missing strings and woodwind, but I still want to call it the orchestral section, if nothing else, just as a good shorthand. Once again, there's a really nice medium point of merging the 2 styles of composition here while still achieving a similar vibe throughout. I guess the more that I think about it, it is a fine track that does provide a little bit of contrast to what we've listened to, even if the end result is still atmosphere, which I think is fine. I tend to like a little bit more variety in my albums. I tend to go for albums that do change, if nothing else than just on the minutia. And this album, sticking with an atmosphere first, heavy, eerie, brooding kind of thing consistently, it's not my cup of tea, but that doesn't mean that it's doing things wrong or that it's a bad album. It's just a bit too stagnant for my taste, which is overall my general criticism with black metal as a whole. And yes, I'm sure there's going to be someone out there, black metal's not all stagnant, but stereotypically, the majority of mainstream black metal. So yeah, it's a nice interlude. Let's get back into our 7-minute epics, I suppose. Next up, we're going to check out Reverse Time, which is... it's a title. I don't know what it means, and unfortunately, we're not going to find out what it means. But let's dive in and see where they decide to take us on the back half of this album. Now see, there is a sharp transition that worked because they retained the rhythm at least. I think that works a lot better than the stuff we saw in the first two tracks. And it's little changes to how they move between ideas. I'm not asking for smooth fluidity the whole time. Just show me some connective tissue. That's it. Even this, once again, a really nice transition, holding out that last note and bringing in the new concept that is presumably going to take us to the next one. Yeah. Pairing up the guitar with the synthesizer, playing the same line. Oh, a similar line, my apologies. And see, given the overall fluidity of moving through our last 3 or 4 sections, the really harsh transition here works well to sell us, hey, we're in a brand new idea now. This isn't the status quo, this is a notification. Once again, though, the transition I think worked better here, but the sections are still so disparate. much like tracks 1 and 2, this almost feels like it was a 3-minute black metal song, which would be pretty standard for the genre. And then their keyboardist decided to tack on something from their side project just to pad it out and make it so that it's not just a bunch of 3-minute songs. I'm not saying that's how it happens, but that is what it feels like to me as a listener. And I love the soundscapes here. I just wish they weren't tied to the other black metal half of this album. Alright. It's time for that moment. I don't know if y'all were taking some bingo bets on this or not. Bingo bets? If y'all were playing bingo or taking bets on this, it is hashtag ruined by the metal time. The atmospheric electronic sections, I think, are the most interesting aspects of these tracks. I really dig when they found that middle ground in track 3, and I wish they had pushed forward with that, but we haven't yet, and there's only one more full song on the album. And I've got my money on the fact that it's going to be just like this was, and track 1 was, and track 3 was. There might be some better fluidity between core ideas, but for the most part, we're probably going to be looking at a 3 or 4 minute post black metal track, and then a 3-minute atmospheric outro. The atmospheric outros are, like I mentioned, the most interesting part to me. The black metal, it is augmented in interesting ways at times, and there are some aspects to it that I'm like, oh, that's kind of neat. But it never clicks for me in a way that makes me want to listen to it. It is still, at its heart, and a majority of its work, black metal. Traditional, stereotypical, third wave black metal. Everything I don't like about the genre is what's presented at its core. And so, as I said earlier, black metal and I were workmates. We get along. We don't want anything to do with each other after hours, though. And so I'm just biding my time throughout most of these, the first half of these tracks. Yep, 16th note picking, blast beats, gnarly growls. All right, let's see if it goes somewhere. That's kind of how I'm going about it, right? And as usual, I'm trying to be critical without leaning into that cynicism. I don't want to shoot it down because it's black metal. I don't want to trash it because it's not my type of music. I've tried to primarily keep away from speaking negatively about the black metal side of it because it just isn't a fruitful conversation. I try to, if I have criticisms, it's about how it's utilized in conjecture with the other ideas and how the tracks are crafted and structured and all of that. I've tried not to do any trashing of the style itself, but it isn't my jam. And so I always find it interesting when it cuts out and we go to pure atmosphere. I'm not going to say that these sections always resonate with me, but I do think that they are interesting, a type of minimalistic isolation through a series of synthesizing melodies and harmonies done through a blackened lens. I think that's the interesting part to it. It carries the weight, the darkness, the eeriness, the unsettling elements of black metal's atmosphere, just not with all of the attacks, not with the bite of the distorted guitars, not with the aggressiveness of the drums and the vocals. And this outro I found equally as intriguing. And the more I thought about it, the more I kind of just want those outros. Most of the time when I talk about a track and there's just one particular aspect of it I like, I'm like, I just wish they had done this, but it would have lost its impact because it wasn't contrasted with this, or it would have lost its importance because it wasn't led up into, right? It's the idea of a payoff, right? The payoff is the important part. It's what people want most of, but you can't get a payoff without the build up. And so you can't just say, I want a song full of payoffs, because it doesn't work that way. And the same thing, happens in other types of music too, where I'm like, I really like this section, but I only like it because it was surrounded by the stuff I didn't like. That's not true here. I don't feel like the atmospheric sections are supported in any way by the metal side. They always feel, as I mentioned earlier, hypothetically, tacked on. These feel like traditional 3 to 4 minute black metal tracks, and then there's just this electronic stuff at the end of it that is loosely alluded to, because occasionally we'll have some synthy stuff going on in the black metal section too. But harmonically, melodically, narratively, there's just nothing that points towards them. While they're going for a similar atmosphere, it's a totally different vibe. And we've already talked about this. There's just a lot of clashing between the two styles. Where I'm going with this is, I would really love to see this group, or maybe even just the composer, whoever that is, make an album of just this atmospheric synth stuff. See where that goes, because I feel like all of these songs are being held back by making sure that they're metallic. I don't know if that was a conscious decision. I like making this eerie music, but who's gonna like it? So let's market it to the black metal crowd. And I gotta throw some black metal in there too. Or if this was something of a mixture. Maybe the synthesizer dude really likes dark wave and synth wave and wants to create these darker atmospheres. And best friend with a guitarist who loves to play black metal, and they're like, well, let's try mashing our sounds together. I don't know how this was created, but I'd really love to hear just the atmospheric aspect. Bring in a guitar every once in a while, right, to spice things up. But let's just stray very far away from that traditional black metal aspect and see what happens when you go for a purely focused electronic style of music. So, yeah, the Ruined by Metal was a bit sensationalist this time, but definitely, I think, held back by the metal. Even going all the way back to one of my first points, where I don't even see that a lot of black metal fans would enjoy this. Not to mention, I had completely forgot about this till now, but it's kind of supported by the fact that Metal Archives won't even put them in their encyclopedia because they're not metal enough. I'm not going to say that they're indicative of everything. I'm sure the Metal Archives are only run by a handful of people, and I'd hate to extrapolate their opinions out to the wider, broader metal scene. But there's certainly at least some people who don't see this as metal enough, which means if they're listening for metal, half of this album isn't appealing to them. I just think it'd be really cool to separate them out. And the black metal aspect is highly iterative. It's been done before, but this electronic stuff, I've never heard anything like this, particularly done this way. I've heard darker, eerier, atmospheric electronic stuff, but this specifically feels unique. Granted, I haven't listened to a lot of it. Maybe it's iterative of that, but it's fresh to my ears. We'll put it that way. And I think it'd be cool just to see how an album evolves from that without being tied to alternating its time, its space with some black metal. We're going to run these final two tracks together, being that after we finish this 7-minute song is only a 2.5-minute outro track. Just put them together. And it's going to wrap it. This is going to be right around 2 hours. A very short album review. I do wish I could have found some lyrics, but black metal's kind of a 50-50. It's like a landmine. I'm really waiting for one of the comments telling me the lyrics are like really not something to dig into. I don't know. Let's dive into this next track, see what's going on with it. Interesting having that little swung. Yeah, got a little bit of a bluesiness to it. I like the division between the distortion and the clean. Putting that in separate channels is a really smart way to go about doing that. Interesting decision to add some lighter elements this far into the track. We also heard some of it in our opening chord progression. Just a little moment of hope against the dreariness of it all. A bit of an eclectic decision. What? This is veering eerily close to Blackened pop music. I will say though, it's interesting. I think it's growing on me. Yeah, just a beautiful little idea there at the end. It's also interesting. The first few tracks had 1 to 2 seconds of silence, and here on the back half we're looking at multiple. That one had like 12. I really want to know the lyrics now. where I thought that was going. Speaking of Baroque, bit of a semi-resolution there. We didn't fully finish the progression, but it didn't end on tension either. Man, talk about a wild ride. So, track 6, I thought we were just going to get more of the same, and we kind of did. We had an interesting rhythmic decision there at the beginning. It was sort of swung at the end of the phrase, like three whole notes followed by some swung quarter notes. Gives it that weight. Ba ba da ba da ba da. It's not the ba 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 ba, the rigidity that we've had this whole album. It's ba da 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 da. It's got a looseness to it. It's the first time we hear it. Also, if you listen to the chord progression going on in the background, there's glimmers of hope. There is, for a small moment in each chord progression, a positive feeling. I don't know what exactly is going on there, chord theory wise, to introduce this positivity, but it is present, and it's something that becomes more present as the track progresses. Up until we have a bit of a transition period, slowly discarding some of those heavier, darker layers and introducing some brighter ones until we have our blackened pop outro. Well, I guess midsection. There's a different outro on track 6. This blackened pop section is kind of bizarre, but works so well. The clean vocals, the brighter melodies, the more positive harmonies, the dancey drum pattern. It all just kind of comes together with this hazy, staticky black metal guitar texture off to the right, just kind of hanging about, creating this fuzzy atmosphere around this whole thing. The production keeps it tight and claustrophobic as well, but musically, it's kind of pop rock. And it's interesting to have an album that I've consistently spoken about in terms of weight, eeriness, darkness, evil, I used at one point, and to have it gradual. This wasn't like this song will be the happy song. It is a gradual movement into this looser, brighter, relaxed sound. It's very interesting. And of course, this led us into track 7, which is very uplifting. Eventually, it kind of takes a little bit of a darker turn and goes into that Baroque sound, but there's a couple of things to deal with that. Baroque music, a lot of it, not all of it, but a lot of Baroque music was written for the church. We associate the sound of it with Halloween now for some reason. I'm not quite sure what happened in the cultural conversation that led us to that. But yeah, back then it was played on organs in churches. A lot of composers during the Baroque era wrote music commissioned by the churches. What we think of as evil, dark music was the music of the church at the time. I always found that to be quite funny. But so even though it is a bit of a darker ending, especially after our brighter, more hopeful beginning of track 7, it still has a spiritual angle to it, and the track is Quaeres spiritus. I don't know. It seems kind of Latin-y. Everything else seems Germany to me. Germany. Everything else looks like German to me. This looks like Latin, though. I'm kind of curious what happens if I translate this. Quaeres. Oh, spiritus. That's easy. Oh, it is Latin, for you are looking for spirits. So I think bringing in the Baroque sound there, not only it matches with the black metal aspect anyways. Black metal as a genre is very fond of utilizing Baroque harmony in their music. It also introduces concepts of the church, religion, and now spirits in the title. I don't know what it all means though. And that's where my statement came from earlier when I said now I need to know the lyrics. I'm usually a bit apprehensive about diving into black metal lyrics. As I said, it's kind of a landmine. No, it's kind of a minefield. I said landmine earlier. Correct myself. It is a minefield. You never quite know what you're gonna get. And so sometimes I kind of take it as a blessing in disguise when we listen to a black metal track or an album in this case and I can't find lyrics. Sometimes it just makes sure I don't put stuff on the channel that I'd rather not be promoting. But in this case, the album tells me a story. We start in darkness and separation, two ideas completely out of sync from one another. As the album goes on, we find this darkness is something that becomes more palpable and resonant across these two opposing ideas until they combine into one and find ways to coexist throughout the middle of the track. And finally moving into track 6, where the darkness sheds its way for a little bit of light that pulls itself further into pop territory, going for something bouncy and brighter, even though there is a dark atmosphere around it, taking us to the I don't quite know how to describe that, the opening of the final track. It's bright, it's hopeful, there's a ton of resolution to it, but of course it isn't perfect. We end up moving towards the Baroque section, which ends on a semi-resolution. But there's still this through line throughout the entire album of, it almost seems to me as finding peace with the darkness. That's what the album speaks to me as. And it makes me want to dig into the lyrics and find out what particular story they might be attributing to this framework. So if anybody has this album, this CD, maybe even a cassette, and you have some liner notes or a little booklet that came with it with the lyrics in it, please let me know. Take some pictures. I will do the transcribing to text and uploading it to places and whatnot so everyone can find it. I would like to know what they are. Alternatively, if anybody can find the lyrics, even if it's not in a physical pamphlet or something, let me know. If you have a way to contact the band, maybe even as a last ditch attempt. I want to know the story going on here because I do think that this album is going to speak to me differently on a second time through. They do start off in a bit of a rough space, and they start off with a lot of black metal elements. And I mean, the black metal elements are all throughout this track, but the atmospheric sections, I think, can make up for that and balance it out well enough for a second listen. And of course, I know, much like I spoke about earlier, I don't like slow burns, but I really love payoffs. So I deal with the tension that the slow burn creates and the slower pacing. I could deal with the black metal elements knowing where it leads. This ending works so well because of all of the darkness and tension and weight and heaviness that we experience on a journey there. this might be a black metal album I give a second listen to on my own, probably, but that is high praise from me. And I think a lot of that comes down to the fact that it's not black metal, it's post black metal, and that's definitely the era of the genre that is most likely to speak to me, anyways. I also am curious if knowing the lyrical story to it will explain the duality of the music in any way that allows me to view it in a more artistic angle rather than the purely musical angle, which makes the division between the two feel a bit flat for me. I still think I would like to hear an album of just the electronic atmospheric stuff, but it's possible that after knowing what they're talking about, I fully understand why it needs to be paired with the black metal element, and how they work together to push that narrative forward. Yeah, I guess that about wraps it up here. Um, Initially, I do want to talk about this real quick because, I just got done talking about how my perspective of this album has changed from beginning to end. I think it was around track 4 or 5, I wrote down what I decided would be in the title of my video: divided and divisive. I thought it was a really cool use of that core root word, while also speaking about how the song is divided between two ideas and kind of divides up the fandom. As I mentioned, this is a song that I think you're either going to love or hate, and I think black metal fans are going to be on one side or the other. It's either going to be something you dig or something that this isn't metal, it doesn't belong near metal. That kind of vibe, right? I have completely changed my mind. I don't know what I'm going to use in the title yet, but it's going to be more positive because I do feel that they set out with a goal in mind and executed on it at some level of competency. I'm not going to say that this was perfectly done, but knowing the end of it, now that I have this narrative in mind, it might not even be a narrative in mind, right? This doesn't have to be a conceptual album. It feels conceptual to me, musically, but it doesn't mean it has to be. But anyways, I have a much more appreciative view of this album now that it's over, now that I know where it went, now that I know that it built all that darkness at the beginning in order to reach these heights at the end. It works a lot better for me, even if I think it has a lot of snags on the way. The overarching concept is nice and executed upon well. And so I don't know where I'm going with that. I just think it's important sometimes to remember that you can't judge art by anything other than its entirety. Sometimes it's the ending that makes the art. Huh. Those are my thoughts on this album that I still can't pronounce, from Nacht und Gnosis. Let me know what you thought of this one. I had a couple questions in here as well. You can put your answers in the comments if you have any. Put your perspectives, opinions, anything else down there as well. And if you have any way of getting the lyrics to me, please let me know. Above the comment section in the description box, you'll find a link to Linktree. It takes you here. You can find links to my music, ways to support the channel, a link to the Discord server, and so much more. Above that, if you could, like, subscribe, and ring the bell. I greatly appreciate all three of those. That wraps it up for today. I'll be back tomorrow morning, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. I might not be morning for you. It'll be morning for me. We are going to do a public live stream with open requests. A little bit of a change up, but we got through all of the patron requests for the live stream. Usually takes 4 weeks, and there happens to be 5 Sundays in October. So instead of taking the week off, I figure let's get the whole community involved this time around. It goes for 2 hours. We're going to finish around 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Give or take, 5 or 10 minutes. I'm not going to cut it off in the middle of a song. um, Come around anytime and hang out, listen to cool music, join a discussion, and make a request. Maybe you'll get picked. It won't be first come, first serve. It's going to be entirely random. So even if you've come in the last 10 minutes, you have just as equal a shot as anyone else to have your selection picked. All right, until next time, remember to be critical, not cynical, of the music you listen to, and have a fantastic morning, afternoon, or evening whenever you choose to watch my videos.